So what are we at? 4 phones, 3 what?
Are we going to give us questions for this one?
We'll take care of it. Just one sec. Yep, we're live.
All right.
Mhm.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special meeting of the Mahone Bay Town Council. And tonight we're joined along with council members, the CAO and deputy CAO, our manager of finance, Ashley Eden Wenzel is here, and she is going to walk us through the proposed budget for 2022-2023. This is council's first opportunity to review the budget that has been prepared. We'll begin by acknowledging that we are gathered tonight in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral, present, and future territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Today, we gather with the intent, followed by the Living Peace and Friendship Treaties. We do so with respect, cooperation, and coexistence. We'll call the meeting to order. And we will note that we do have some folks at home who are following our discussion on YouTube. And if you should have questions about the discussion this evening, the budget in particular, if you would, I think the Deputy CAO would put the questions in the box on the screen.
That's correct.
And they would be addressed at the end of the meeting. And we will take about a 60-second pause at the end of the meeting, just in case, because there is a time delay between when you may choose to put your question in and the meeting may be concluded. So we appreciate your participation and we appreciate your questions. Council, you have an agenda that was emailed to you. Entertain a motion to approve the agenda as presented. Councillor Wilson, seconded by Councillor Now. All in favor? Motion is carried. Thank you. And there is one item on this agenda, and that's the presentation of the draft 2023 budget by our manager of finance. And just before we go to you, manager of finance, I would ask the CAO if you had any preliminary comments you'd like to make before your finance manager begins her presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I will note a couple of things here, and I appreciate the opportunity. First off, we're quite a bit later into the year than we would normally be for a budget process, and also we have a new manager of finance here, Ashley Wenzel. So that actually is part of why we're a little bit late into the financial year at this point. We had a turnover in our finance department just when the budget process would be normally getting underway, and made the determination that time to wait a little bit further into the fiscal year to give actually only exactly enough time to prepare. We're not going to even an hour extra. So I hope everybody will be on her first presentation, and we've had a lot of conversation, of course, the budget about opportunities for her to put her own stamp on it next year with lots of time to prepare. So we'll look forward to some changes to the process, I'm sure. And I guess I'll just also note as a general context around the annual budget process, our budget, even the late one, does precede the annual audit. So you'll see in the budget that there is a unaudited actual for the year that just ended 2021-22. But that does not represent our final year end. Obviously, that has to be audited with an external auditor. So there is a presentation there around how we ended the year. It's not a bad one, it's a positive one. But before we go off and go to the bank with that, we want to make sure that that is an accurate representation. So we'll return to that. What do we do about the year end? If we had a surplus, what can we do with that surplus in terms of putting it into reserve for all of the great stuff we're doing this year and in future years once the audit is completed, which is intended to be in September. And yeah, I think that's basically the context for the budget. I'll turn it over to Ashley.
All right, thank you very much. So
Welcome to the 2022-23 budget presentation, the long awaited. Everyone's excited. Okay, so bear with me here. This isn't my laptop, so I might be. There we go. Okay, so March 3rd, 2022, I don't need to tell you guys, but you directed staff to present a budget with no increase in tax rates, fire tax rates, or general operating expenses over 10%. So that was a challenge, but something we rose to the occasion to do. And I'm happy to announce that our overall expenses are at 9.57%. So we managed to stay under the 10%. So yay. Okay. So if you go to the summary page, so you guys have the actual budget in front of you. And then the PowerPoint is just sort of, I'm going to focus on sort of the main points within each section. So for the summary page, the revenue for the year, we're showing at 3.1 million. Prior year's budget, we showed at 2.9 million. So we have an increase of 6.88%. And then net expenses, this year we're showing 2.7 million, last year 2.4, with an increase of 9.57%, as I mentioned a moment ago. Excess revenue over expenditures, 306,794, and change in fund position at a negative 724. All right, so now move on.
You want to comment about if people have questions or comments, if you prefer them to let you go to a certain point, let you go all the way through, speak up.
I can go wherever you want me to go. So if you want to interrupt, by all means. Sometimes you have a burning question that needs to be answered immediately. So I don't know if there's a particular desire, but I'm flexible either way. Under the capital expense.
Mayor has a question.
Yes, absolutely. So I don't have the page numbers right now. Perhaps I could. I'm looking off of. No, I'm looking off it, but I can definitely, if you give me a moment to kind of get myself organized. I'm looking off Excel and PowerPoint, so we're in a different, where's this? Yeah, so page 3 is what I'm looking at right now. Yep, thank you. So, so the capital expenses. So if you compare it over last year's budget, our general government expenses, capital expenses went down 95%. The other large drivers, transportation services, went up 193%. Environmental development services went up only 2.99%, but note that we have spent 1.2 million. We're budgeting for 6.4, so that means that we have spent money and we've created new projects to kind of fill in the gap, the void there. So it doesn't seem like we've gone up by too much, but we've also had a lot of activity for that. Environmental health services went up 24.64%, and rec and culture went down 16.6%. So the main ones are the general government and the transportation to drive those.
What was behind that huge jump in transportation services?
That is a great question, and I don't have that right off. But I can definitely get that for you.
But these are operational expenditures, not capital investments, right?
These are capital.
These are capital investments.
Yeah, that's right, Dylan. Yeah. Yeah.
Capital, not expenses.
Yeah.
Capital investments.
So these are changes in. So there's a capital summary on here that'll break it down between transportation, the town, water, electric, and it'll basically show what our current capital projects are. So this is just basically taking the total from last year and showing you the change over the year. So it's going to be many things, but we can definitely get you a summary of that for sure. Okay.
So fast through the operating summary, probably compared to we would maybe have lingered on it just a tad more. So moving right to the capital. I will just comment for people who are looking at the paper that on page 2, I said, this is an audited column, but the bottom of page 2 is the column that is revenue over expenditure for last year. So where did we end up last year? So obviously zero budget, unaudited actual, we're looking at a pretty decent surplus, and then we intended it to be a zero budget. I see we're presenting a $700 deficit. That's one of those things that probably just happened in the final spreadsheet.
Okay, so we're gonna look now at the rate sheet. So that is. Okay, so I'd say let's look at page 9 or, yeah, page 8 and 9, please. Okay, so as mentioned before, we don't have a rate increase this year. So we're relying on assessment growth for revenue. So there wasn't, if you look here, if you look at the residential, the resource and the commercial, the main growth was in the residential, which I think is pretty obvious based on what's going on or what has been going on the last couple of years with the housing market and the increased costs of everything. So it's about a 15% jump. So that's where we're going to see our revenue on, that's where we're going to see most of our revenue driven.
And I'm sorry, Ashley.
Yeah,
are
absolutely.
The 169,800,000, is that the capped assessment or the pre-capped assessment?
169.
Our net, I assume that's our
Yes.
our number net of the cap.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
Taxable
Yeah.
assessment.
Yeah. Exactly.
Plus 19 million.
And then page 12 is the one that is the breakdown. The next page is the one that's the breakdown of what that is made up of in terms of, you always want to look at is new
Yeah.
construction versus,
Yeah, exactly.
And the unfortunate growth in assessment, we determined growth in assessment. I think we thought, it's always going to be growth in assessment. If you look at the commercial, we're actually seeing, you may not notice the negative, but we're seeing
Yeah.
a substantial reduction in assessment.
Yeah.
Doesn't offset the growth in residential, but it does offset a quick bit of it. That's how we get down to a single digit growth in revenue this year. We looked at that growth in residential assessment in double digits, but.
Okay, so we're gonna go over to the total revenue tab, which is, second, what page are we? Sorry, I'm just looking through the document here. I have it on mine and okay, page 19, please. Note to self for next time. Okay, so as we mentioned that there are no increases in the tax rate this year. So we're relying just on assessment increase. The deed transfer tax, you will notice on this is we've budgeted 180,000. Last year we were at 160. Now the actual unaudited amount this year is 326,000. So it is substantially more than what I budgeted for, but the market is starting to soften. I don't want to get overexcited about any possible revenue coming in. So I'm trying to take a very conservative approach. I bumped it up a little bit, but I'm more comfortable with leaving it where it is than to try to duplicate last year, especially with the market softening. So, and then the other main point there's two more points on here I want to mention. You scroll down to provincial government, the municipal grant. We actually received an extra payment this year, which was correct. So on September 14th, 21, a letter was sent out just saying that there would be an extra payment this year. I have not seen any indication of that letter for this year. So
It's page 22.
yeah, that's the 75,000 and now so now we're going back down to 50 for this year. Sorry, yeah, page 22. So last year we budgeted 50, then we received 75, so I'm going back down to the 50 again. So
That letter, I guess, illuminate for anyone the homeowner, the public, who I'm sure don't,
Yeah.
indicated that the $25,000 increase was to tide municipalities over while a new service exchange agreement was negotiated.
Yeah.
Which we still don't have one, but that's gonna have to stretch over a couple of years.
Yes, agreed. And then what I find to be the very interesting one is the area dividend. So last year we budgeted $71,000. We received almost double. I've spoke to area and had long conversations about them. We're expecting a decreased trend in dividends starting next year. And last year it seemed like it was exceptional. So I budgeted more than last year, but I didn't want to get, again, overly excited about 140,000 coming in. I can confirm though that it is very likely that we won't see that type of dividend again. And as I said, in the 23, 24 and onward, it's expecting that we will see a lot less sizable dividends. So it was good while it lasted. But yeah, so that's sort of that's the main points I wanted to make on the revenue tab. I don't know if anybody had any questions. I think they just had, they were driving more power and then they're able to provide it back to us. So when they sell it, then the revenue they obtain.
Yeah, I mean, I know it was into the year was like a pretty cautious projection.
Yeah.
If the weather is good and the turbines overproduce, they do generate more power.
Yeah, and then they'll sell it and we usually see some of that.
I mean, I'm sure we'll have a conversation about areas' ability to maintain the dividend, which doesn't have anything to do with profitability. It just has to do with our requirements to have reserves in area. Which
The fact that they give all of it back to us, when
yeah,
they do have
surprises me that given last year's numbers, but in the absence of seeing this year's financials from area, which I'm sure will be forthcoming, we'll have a better idea, but I wouldn't count on any dividend. I'm surprised actually that
Well, I
they're
don't think that they're empowered to hang on to it. Like, I think that they're giving it to us because that is the structure of the area and the price.
That's what I
But
understand.
the board should probably have that.
As long-
conversation.
as long as the reserve covenants met dividend out of all the surpluses. But anytime we've ever talked to them, there's been a requirement for retention of cash so that they can, manage the business. That's the message that we consistently heard, right? So.
We know a couple of things. 800,000 for the last 3 years. And we currently don't have $1 million in escrow as required by the province. So we've got a double whammy, coming to do it.
Anyway, we'll know more when we get the report. But that surprises me that we would be able to step on it, to accept it. So again, just so we're all on the same page, that has nothing to do. The dividend isn't necessarily or lack thereof wouldn't be correlated to the profitability in area. We really a cash management issue, like stewardship issue, board of directors making sure that the entity had enough cash to run their business efficiently. It's not that the money goes away or there's less of it. It's just, is it better left in their hands or better left with the equity owners? Anyway, it's not a bad story. It's just. Yeah, exactly. It's very, very difficult. Yeah, it's difficult to say on one hand, you require more. You require a line of credit to cash flow the business, but on the other hand, dividending out with all the cash.
Yeah.
That's illogical. Anyway, noted my doubt. We'll know more soon.
To be continued. Okay, we're going to go to page 25 on the general government services. You gave me time to find that, so thank you. So first off, and this applies to the other departments and utilities, for anything salary based, we decided 4.1% increase is appropriate for this year. So you'll see that throughout the presentation. So things like the mayor's expense, council's expense, CAO's expense, that is coming back after COVID, after the restrictions with COVID have lifted. lifting, the expenses are starting to come back. People are starting to travel more. You're starting to do more of the activities we used to do. But we're kind of still in a transition year. So we've decided to allocate those expenses, those pre-COVID expenses over the next 2 years to kind of give us a way to break into and see exactly where our expenses fall this year and how much we need to possibly increase next year. One of the new things we have is we have a new cleaning company. So that has increased our costs. So let me see here. This is on a different page. So just give me a second. Right here, page 26. So you'll notice that our budgeted amount is 16,000, whereas last year our budgeted amount was 8,200. So our costs have increased substantially. But I will make note too that our unaudited actual numbers last year were 20,000. So it's my understanding that a lot of the chemicals and cleaning supplies were actually purchased by the cleaners and billed to us. So this price is basically all encompassing. It's an invoice. Here's what it is. Here's it's divided into the different utilities and areas that it will be. So this should be a fairly reliable price. I had divided it amongst the different areas like fire and water and electricity. So you'll see this line pop up in other areas as well. We have a new operating initiative for a new town logo. So that should be funded out of the operating reserve, and we have budgeted 25,000 for that. And let me see if I can show you where that is. Second. You guys are testing my memory here now. Thank you, Joe. Page 25. Perfect. And then, and last but not least, we have a change in our audit fee. So what we're hoping to do this year, as well as our regular financial audit, is to also bring in Deloitte for an internal controls audit. Reason for that is that we just want to make sure that because there's been so many shifts in people and changes, and we're bringing on a new software system, Maintain X, we just want to make sure that all our ducks are appropriately in row. We had an issue with our inventory last year and controls around the inventory. So that's one of the reasons it's kind of spiked our interest to do this. Now, this hasn't been brought to council yet. So it's pending approval, and I think Dylan and I will put something together to make sure that that is. So this is just I guess a heads up, not necessarily.
We want a committee meeting coming up later this month.
Yeah.
The budget process happens to coincide. So we'll bring the proposal and
Yeah.
go over the specifics of the audit committee.
So as it stands right now, we're at 2850 for the audit budget for this year, which breaks down to about 21.8 for the actual audit. The internal controls audit for the general government section which is 50% of the total cost, is 27,003, and then we've put in a margin of a couple thousand for otoscope issues in case there's something, which hopefully there's not, but usually when there's a change in management or a change in employees, it happens.
So this line item represents the general government share of the base audit fees and projected overage that we might have, but also 100% of that operating initiative. And the reason being that as an operating initiative, the internal control audit would also be financed from operating reserves, the one-time cost. So it really doesn't matter that much. We don't break down the cost of the internal controls audit between the utilities and everything. Rightly speaking, they all benefit. In fact, it was the electrical utility whose inventory was material enough to trigger this warning about inventory controls last year.
So let's go to page 33. Nope, sorry, I lied. Yep, nope, page 33 for you guys. I just have to do this. Protective services. So this one is pretty cut and dry. We received the amount from the RCMP outlining how much the cost of services are going to be. So $380,000 last year. We budgeted for $342. It came in around $343. So I would say that it's pretty reflective of what we're going to be paying this year.
Under the provincial contract, we don't get any change for changes in our operating costs, so better or worse, we will pay pretty much exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And then the bylaw enforcement officer, that amount is 13,000 this year. It was about 10 last year. We increased it a little bit for salary and clothing, and then the 4.1 cost of living. So it's gone up because everything has basically gone up, but
We did a small increase in hours mid-year last year, so that probably wasn't fully reflected last year.
and then that's true. There was some that I think were even maybe not reported fully. So we were trying to make sure we had the clear picture of exactly what it's going to cost us this year. Okay. Yes.
Maintenance of police office. My understanding is that don't use that as a police office.
Yeah, every time that we get here, we should move it, and before we get to the final version of this, if you support it, we'll move that over to public works.
Yeah. Excellent eye.
The next question.
Yes.
This page in Subsidies.
Nope, by all means.
What are those figures transferred to Recreational services?
And so actually, I don't know if maybe I can speak to that.
Yeah.
This has been new.
Yes.
Those supposed to be our share of court services fees, so I don't think it's broken down to what happens in our particular community, but we are responsible to share the bailiff and court costs associated with policing activity. So that's just our share of that, mandatory share of that. Probably just help us, but.
Okay. Other protective services. So we're looking at page 35, please. This one's pretty simple as well. So basically the REMO, which is the emergency measures, is consistent with prior year for the most part. The animal and pest control, same thing. So we have insurance, we have our regular insurance, but we've now also obtained cyber insurance. So there's going to be that's a new insurance for this year for all utilities, all departments. So there's a slight allocation there for that. So the insurance has increased by 2,200, which is a mix between our regular insurance and the cyber insurance addition. Yeah.
So those kind of things normally noted there is the building inspection cost does include the legal contingency, which is financed from operating reserve if we incur it. And we don't typically, we haven't, but it's embedded in that cost.
Yeah.
As a legal contingency.
Yeah.
So that the cyber insurance, that's what's flowing through from Joint Services Board, and you're just allocating it out.
Yes, yeah, I think the note probably comes up in a few other places too. We'll have to look at making it come up the first time it comes up in the package, but essentially all of insurance costs across the board have a component now of cyber insurance that was procured through the MJSP process.
So there's a couple, you'll notice throughout the whole presentation, there's a couple expenses that we maybe haven't allocated accordingly to all areas before that we are now. So that's why you'll see things kind of popping up. All right, transportation services. So that starts on page 37. Okay, so perfect example, the answering service and the finance software. So and it basically under administration right there, the answering service. So again, we talked about this, and basically the answering service are for the utilities. So originally it was under general governance. It doesn't really make sense to be there because usually when people are calling, they're calling to talk to me at 10 o'clock at night. They're calling because something broke or something's exploded. So they're working. So we've now allocated those costs to the public works, the water, and the wastewater. And then the finance. So our new system is called Maintain X, and that is a new PO system that we're going to be using, and that's going to be used across all the departments. The electric is now sort of the test run of it, and so we're also sharing. Report's also going to be using the system, so we're sharing costs with them as well. So some of the costs will be split between us and Riverport. I don't know.
How is this, excuse me,
Yeah.
anything to do with town suite?
No, so this is, we were last budget, Luke had mentioned that he was hoping to provide the town suite PO section. But after we looked at it, looked at the cost and looked at what it could do, we decided that MaintainX would be a better alternative.
Okay, so this is a total separate piece.
Exactly, so that part is no longer on the table. This is a brand new software, and it will talk to town suite, but it is something completely different, yes. Okay, so in the public's work, under small tools and equipment, which there we go on page 40. My notes here. So we budgeted 5,000 and we've gone up to 10. And basically there's storage that needs to be done, I guess, in the building, and Jonathan has provided a cost of about $5,000 for that. So it's a decent increase, but I think it's very much needed.
The council knows that we've deferred to our next meeting a conversation about where Public Works will be in the future. So this is obviously pending any decision around that. Just we always have some cost in association with a new building or a move between locations. So this is just to kind of get at that one-time increase in cost that would be associated with whatever Public Works facilities decision council.
Exactly. Thank you. And then health and safety, which is under the other, so it's just like maybe 7 lines down on page 40. So that basically includes 2 full-time staff and 2 seasonal staff. So it's an increase of about $1,600. So
health and safety is PPE for the most part. We have fallen a little bit behind in terms of clothing and gear over the years. So with Jonathan here as the new manager, one of his priorities is making sure the staff are appropriately attired and equipped. And so we'll see some improvement in that, but there's an attendant cost in that as well.
I hope you recycled there, sold that.
I don't know, maybe took that with him on retirement. I don't know.
I'm sure.
Kelly hasn't framed it here.
We'll have
So.
a little bit of debate of which or many town logos will go on the new.
Yeah.
and then on page 42, you'll notice under roads and streets, there is about $5,500 increase under patching streets, sidewalks, and other. And that's basically to do with the rising cost of oil and gas. It's just going to cost more to run everything to perform these tasks. So that is certainly a trend in a lot of the utilities, especially in transportation.
So actually, the first line, the salaries has gone up a lot.
Yes, so we have a new allocation this year for salaries. And there's actually, I think we're going to discuss some things in closed session afterwards.
So I guess, yeah, there's council previously made a decision around replacement of one of our staff people who retired this year, who was a part-time employee. And we've gone out and replaced that person with a full-time employee that's a Public Works employee.
Yeah.
So that's reflected here. And then we have 2 additional staffing proposals, one of which is reflected here, which we want to discuss with council in closed session. If they continue to be in the budget when it is finalized by council, then obviously we'll include some notation to explain to anybody following along. But if not, want to make sure that people who are affected by that, their privacy as far as that goes is continued.
One of the things that would help me, because when you change allocations and move stuff around from year to year without any detail, in fact, it's difficult for me at least to follow. Is if we could have a page somewhere that showed staffing levels, and I don't care about individual salaries necessarily, but just sort of gross up the numbers so that we would know how many people we had in each department last year versus how many proposed in each department in the next year. That would give me a better idea of where we're headed.
Yeah,
Sure, we can have that for the 14th.
Yeah, that's no problem at all. I have that information, so. Okay, and culverts and ditching. So this is going to be a one-time cost, about $12,500. It is still on page 42. Now that's gonna be funded out of the operating reserve, so,
But to be fair, it's kind of a two-time cost, because if you look at the actual for last year, you'll remember that Jonathan had come to council and proposed some additional ditching on Long Hill and Main, and that did take place. We had a discussion about whether ditching was capital. You know, it's a tough one. It's very capital-like. We're making an improvement, we're spending a substantial amount of money, it's not an ongoing expense, but you're not really ending up with a capital asset, it's a ditch. So we're treating it the same way, it's a one-off cost, so it should be funded from reserve, but it, you know, wouldn't actually be capital, so that's why it's in here the way that it is. And you know, we'll have opportunity to talk about where they want to put their focus, but I just wanted everybody to understand it's a little bit unusual to see something like that here rather than in the capital budget, which we're going to get to.
I'm just curious about that. The ditching makes sense, but the culvert is an asset.
Yeah, see, typically when we do the culverts like Long Hill, the actual cost of the culverts was borne by the residences. So I don't think we end up with, like, it's called culverts and ditch, that's just the line item's always been called culverts and ditching.
Yeah.
But you'll see when we get the capital, we have a culvert work on the Jubilee Park culvert that the pond drains down into the brook. That is a capital item, a single culvert project that has a fairly substantial price tag associated with it. So yeah, if there is a capitalizable culvert, that will be a capital item, yeah.
As distinct from driveway culverts,
Yeah, which we don't actually own the driveway culverts, yeah.
but we do the maintenance on them.
Yeah, and there's, like, when we're doing a section, we kind of go back to the property owners and say, you know, would you want to replace this? We're gonna do all this other work, it's to your benefit. And I will say, like with Long Hill, everybody was quite agreeable with that project.
all right. And finally, the last sort of large jump would be an addition to a vegetation and tree removal contract service, around $20,000. So this would be a contract position, just to kind of deal with the vegetation and tree removal around town.
But we always had that service in one way, shape or form, didn't we? We just, and I understand we just fired it out.
Yeah, so we should comment on that. So I think that the amount that is listed here, the only real distinction here is that normally we've done this stuff as needed. The electric utility has a proactive budget around it. But this coming year, the cemetery, we'll see when you get to the cemetery, has a substantial chunk of tree removal work that is planned. And so we're looking at, you know, we're going to contract out a chunk of work this year. Public Works has some other tree removal work we'd like to do as well. So basically there's one big, $30,000 because it's 20,000 cemetery, one big tree removal effort this year. And then there will always be electric utility, tree trimming, and occasional as needed tree work. So that's why yeah, we'll have to work on the note maybe just to make it clear what the difference is.
That number, I guess, doesn't really surprise me in the context of our walkabout around Bayview.
Yes.
And I mean, I think we quickly identify, I'm not sure what percentage of this is labor versus like third-party contracting out for boom trucks and things going. But anyway, I think, I guess it's no big surprise that we knew that these kinds of costs were coming.
Yes, please. I don't want to steal Councilor Carver's thunder, but I'm hoping that somewhere here we're going to see a budget, a line item for tree replacement.
A tree planting program from the town's perspective.
We don't have one yet. The only reason we don't, I mean, that's something we've talked a lot about, but obviously the development of the urban forest master plan is intended to provide council with an understanding every year about what our tree replacement costs should be, to essentially set that going forward. But, you know, maybe we should plug an amount in there this year just to get started on that, even though the initiative is this year. Right?
If I may just.
Yes, please.
1 second. I've been thinking about this a bit. I'm wondering why we couldn't, for example, just create a program that we would purchase a number of 100 trees, 200 trees
A year.
for property owners to be planted on their property in approved places.
I think that's exactly the kind of action that you'd contemplate under the urban forest master plan. We just, haven't done that, but that's the kind of action you would want to look at yet. Because as Mo will quickly attest to, we don't have that many places on public property to continue to plant trees. But there are some, and there are lots on private property.
All right, over to environmental health services on page 46, please. So we have $1,000 increase on maintenance on pumps. The PS3 pump needs an overhaul. Now the large one, which I believe is on this page, yeah. So on page 47, we have a $16,000 increase for chemicals PAA line, which is basically as a result of higher costs due to rising transportation costs and overall chemical costs. So that's a substantial increase. Yeah, I know. Yeah, but I spoke to Scott about it and he did some pretty good math around it. So, yeah.
So one thing with the PAA chemical costs is that we have had a project underway now, and it's unfortunately taken quite a while to get CBCL. We're brought on to engineer a change to our chemical building that would allow the storage of a larger volume tote as opposed to what we're getting now in barrels. So that would be a way to get bulk orders to cut down on the number of trips. Would hopefully be a way to do it a little bit more cheaply. So that should be complete this fall, but it's been a bit of a slow process getting the tender together. We ran into some ventilation issues and thought, well, this would be a great opportunity. We'll solve the ventilation issues in the chemical building at the same time. It's just taking longer to get the tender scope than I thought.
And then finally, the data lines line. We were supposed to purchase a new modem last year. It's still on page 47. We hadn't, so I budgeted for that 3,500 again this year. So it was 3,500 last year. So that's a kind of a 2021 expense carried forward. And then you will see again the answering service right underneath the data lines, and that's again just us breaking it out from general to the actual applicable utilities and departments that it applies to. So it's about 600. Environmental health services. Okay, and public health.
Titles.
US.
These are the titles we've always used to
Oh, I
conform with
know.
the provincial reporting, but it's just, we just went through environmental health services, which is wastewater
I
or
know,
sewer.
it makes it sound way nicer.
Yeah. And now we're in the public health, which is, cemetery management.
Yeah, I know. Try being a new person trying to learn names.
The message there, I think.
Yeah. All right, so we're on page 51. So we have, as the CIO mentioned, this is for cemetery. So the Natural Asset Mapping Initiative, we have 11,394 budgeted for that. And our operating grants have increased, as you can see here. Now it's broken out to Park Cemetery, and you'll see this a little more when we get to the cemetery budget. But the Park Cemetery grant from the town is going to be 10,950, and the Bayview Cemetery is 27,570. And it's basically part of that is 3,000 for stone repairs and 20,000 for trees. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the other half of it.
Yeah. So you'll see that once we get down to there. And for the regional housing, so they provided me with a range of 16,310 and an upper range of 19. I've chosen the upper range just based on trending cost. And again, I'd rather assume the worst and for expenses. So that's why I decided that number. So any questions on that? It's pretty.
I'll just make a quick note. The Natural Asset Mapping Initiative, I think the full title we originally had was the Cemeteries and Natural Asset Mapping Initiative, but just so that everybody understands that it's interrelated, we got a grant from the province for a staff person who is currently with us, a summer staff person, to go around and do mapping and take coordinates and gather information. And the Park Cemetery was part of that. And then the other part of that was natural assets on town properties throughout the community. So it's really a kind of a split, but where do you split the natural asset side out to? It doesn't really make that much difference. So we left it here under public health, I think public health is as good a place as any for natural assets, so.
Okay, and then if we go to page 53, please.
Oh, and for some reason, the housing initiatives doesn't have any reference to, so that's the development of the housing strategy. It's carried over from last year. It was always in the strategic plan for this to begin this year and be completed next year. So that's, you'll see that detailed with an explanation in the operating initiative sheet when we get there, but that's what that $30,000 is.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, we'll have to go back and catch a couple of those notes because I think they just get deleted in the
Yeah,
final
I
shuffle.
think a
Yeah.
few things just, yeah. Okay, so we're
The
on,
version that comes out electronically might have a couple of different notes.
okay, so, so public compensations, we have increased our budget by about 8,000, so that would include.
What page are you on?
Sorry, 53.
It's 53, okay.
Am I, yeah, right there, other environmental services. I know. So, yeah, so if you go to the notes on page 55, you'll see that the cleaning company is driving the majority of that, as well as the motion passed to keep the stations open to December 9th. So obviously it's gonna cost us more to run them because of that. And then we have to clean them as well, so.
Just to keep one of them open.
Sorry?
We're keeping one of them open.
Yeah,
keeping
sorry,
Edge one
sorry, I
open.
pluralized, yeah.
Is that what, we spent 37,000 on the comfort stations last year?
Yeah, well, you'll see the town office was also up and some of that was COVID cost. There was an extra cleaning for some of the year for both of those facilities. And then now, of course, as Ashley said, the cost of the products is also driving the cost up. And we did have a.
So that's just to maintain them, that's not counting what work we did to upgrade them a little bit.
That's.
Yeah, no, that's just the operating, yeah, that's the
Mhm.
operating cost. So now we're getting, is for anybody who's really interested in what this gets you, I wanted to get the per usage amount, like if you had to put $1 in or whatever. So we have a counter now, so in every month's report to council, you can actually see how many, you don't have to see them, but you can know how many people went to the washroom.
I'll take a picture, that would be an issue.
I think it's an important line item when we talk commercial tax rates.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's a big number, right?
It's
37,000
something that
plus capital.
needs to be included with in our discussions with the chamber.
Well, fortunately, they're not here discussing that tonight, but I
No,
mean,
not tonight.
I think we get part of the equation,
It's a
right?
number to have.
Oh, Ashley, you may want to look on page 53. I think we were going to split cemetery natural asset because it comes up now in the full amount in both these two places.
Excellent.
So it's
Excellent.
$5,500 of savings. I think you'll make sure you see what I'm seeing, but I just noticed that it was
Already
included here.
Halfway there.
And also on this page, just for counselors, under community development, we do have a budget there for an anti-racism and discrimination initiative. We don't have any kind of clarity around what that consists of or what the budget would be. So what we've done is we've just mirrored the cost for the accessibility initiative. So that's the town's contribution for our accessibility coordinator and the work that she does. And we figured, since there is a lot of discussion around doing something similar on anti-racism and discrimination, that should be included. We've had some conversations about, councils being asked to make a budgetary commitment, even though we don't know what the amount would be. So that's how we got 6,600. I'll admit, it's not based on necessarily the approach that will be arrived at, but we couldn't prejudge what approach
Yeah,
that will be.
exactly. And and just the line right above it, actually, the 31,000 is a carried forward budget number from the previous year when the work wasn't completed. So.
It's just a question about the legal services and advertising. It talks about, the note says it's a land use bylaw and NPS review process. So shouldn't that be regional planning rather than legal and advertising services?
Yeah, it was put under legal services and advertising in the first place, so Ashley just carried it forward, but it's a good point that it is probably better titled under regional planning. Regional planning is the cost of our contract to Chester for the planning services that they provide. But I think it would certainly make sense to have it there. You just have to have a note to show why it's disappeared from one and reappeared in the other.
Yeah.
Except when I read it that way, then I'm sort of thinking, well, we're paying a lot of money for legal
Yeah.
services.
Absolutely.
What are our problems? I'm not so sure what our problems are. And then another, I guess, just a weird question is around environment, as in then the headline, environmental and development services. So for me, that whole thing has nothing to do with environmental anything. For me, it has to do, you can say, call it community development. So my question was, and you talked about this in the previous heading, are these headings things we can change, or?
Environmental development services is being come down from on high. Now, we can change all of these headings. Like, we're not obligated to use them. Ashley and I were talking about what she might want to do differently next year, but essentially we work backwards from the financial information return. So it prescribes certain headings. So when Ashley's filing that, the easiest thing for her to do would be have the exact same headings. She can also have a document that just links the headings we use to the headings needed for the FIR. Like, that's just work that, you know, thankfully, if we have a well-staffed finance department that Ashley should have time to work on, then that's the kind of thing we can do. And it certainly does improve the transparency for the public who don't need to know what environmental development services is. And it is a strange mixture, as you say, of community development. And then under other environmental services, we have some actual environmental services there, you know, as our climate coordinators, things like that.
I guess so. For me as a layperson, I'd be very confused to say, well, you have environmental health services, and then now you have environmental development services. It just confuses me.
Yeah. One is sewer, and the other is building permits. Just what you'd expect to do.
Yeah.
So, not that I expect the changes now, but just thinking about in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Something a little more common sense and a little easier. I completely agree. As someone who's kind of new to this, so there's been several questions too that I'm kind of like, what? So I feel your pain. Okay, so if we wanted to go over to recreational and cultural services on page 56, please. I mainly wanted to point out here that the salaries have changed here, and it's basically salary allocation. So the public works manager, 30% of salary is now going here, whereas it hadn't in the past. So you'll see an increase in the salaries, and that's
Why?
So the other part of public works is term transportation. And so the implication would be that the manager of public works and transportation does 100% of the work on transportation. But the other aspect of it, aside from facilities, is maintenance of our parks and green spaces. And so since that is a big part of the job, that's being better reflected here. Yeah.
So the parks and green spaces.
Yeah.
Versus recreation program.
Yeah. If we were looking at reheading these things, we might refer to this as parks or green.
We don't have a right.
Yeah. No rec programming. No, hope nobody gets excited watching this. But it does include things like the support that Public Works does for the pool. Like every year, in order to get the pool open, there's a considerable amount of work that Public Works does behind the scenes, even though the Pool Society actually provide the program.
And the tennis courts. So.
Well, the tennis court's a little bit more arm's length than the pool. We don't do as much, but you know, we do have interaction. Certainly, Public Works does support some of the other facilities.
okay. And then if you want to, please go over to page 60.
Just a quick question.
Yes, absolutely.
Around the parks, fields, and playgrounds, we don't have staff that are doing the work. The work is contracted out. Is that my understanding, or?
So only right now, we do normally have staff. We had a staff person leave recently, and so we've been contracting it just for the past month and a half. When we get to the discussion around personnel, we'll have a conversation about the future of those services. Yeah.
And I believe the pool is in there as well.
The pool was in that last sheet. Yeah, and there was a note, which again seems to be gone, about the pool, just saying that their operating costs are still heightened. We were doing one more year at the increased $15,000,
Yeah.
understanding it should drop down now with, I mean, whatever gets cheaper, so we'll have another conversation next year.
They
but
must have chemical issues.
They have certainly struggled to get through COVID and now everything else that's going on in the economy, so there's a bigger conversation around the pool facility investment. But presuming that we, continue to keep the pool up and running, we'll talk about the operating costs again next year.
So on page, any more questions? Not yet? Okay. So page 60, education, fiscal services and transfers. So because of the timing of this budget, we do have our education is going to be issued this year. So that's a good number. And then the tax rebate has been amended based on the new motion to increase the, yeah, you can see right there for the new brackets for low income.
So this was based on council's recent motion. We haven't actually revised the low income
So
policy bylaw. Is it a bylaw? Paul?
Yeah, it's still, yeah, the old one's still there. I just wanted to reflect that the change and the difference.
So I think that motion also requested, so the council would understand the implication of that new process, of those new metrics. So do we know the impact on tax rebate? That was the motion, right? Come back.
The motion was not to do it, the motion was to find out
How much
what
it
it
would
would
be.
cost.
Will cost.
But
Yeah.
my assumption is that this just puts a number there so that in case there's something that.
Yeah, a draft of the document with a staff report would be presented to council shortly, but
Yeah.
we have the financial part of it. This is an estimate,
No,
so.
fair enough. I'm just saying, this isn't, we're not passing this by omnibus. That motion will come back and we'll have a little two paragraphs.
Yeah, there would certainly, you would have to amend the
Impact will
bylaw,
be,
yeah.
You know,
And so between now and when this budget would be adopted,
okay,
we would intend to introduce that for council, and yeah.
okay.
So, let me understand, so the new cost is going to be 30, I'm lost on my pages, but the new cost is going to be $30,000? If we make the switch?
Threshold.
Yeah, well, that's a threshold, but it's budgeted at 30,000. So on page 60, you'll see note 5. It is budgeted at 30 based on, so what I did was I took the list from last year and I applied these new thresholds to them. And that's the number that,
So what was 10?
What was 10 is now 30.
yeah, so the 230s are completely separate. So that's just, one is just literally the range and the other one is how much I calculated
Okay.
based on. the prior
Coincidence,
year.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's just.
But this is based on, an assumption about uptake, right? So we know how many people applied last year and what their credits would have been.
Exactly.
We
That's
don't
what I
know
based it on.
how many additional people may qualify and,
So it's
this is an
likely
estimate, but
more,
it could be
but-
more.
Yeah, it's hard to tell, so I just used basically the information I had from last year and extrapolated to the new rates.
I'd just like to say out loud for anybody in the public who's watching, that the education mandatory contribution is $444,000. That's just saying.
The province bills. The province bills.
Yeah, the province bills us for that, yeah.
We hide it in our property taxes.
So that is what I wanted to go through on that page in particular. Does anybody have any more questions on that? There's some more information on the notes that'll give you a breakdown of what's coming from the operating reserve. So you'll be able to tie that back to further down on the spreadsheet. But I didn't think I needed to probably go over it every single one. You can tie most of these back to the operating initiatives. There's a couple of things like that culverts work, that's a one-time item that we've also put in here, but for the most part, the special initiatives should be great to be able to tie these back over to.
And when we get to the operating initiative sheet, they've got. the bigger
Exactly,
detail.
yeah.
Is that education line item, is that a number that we've already received, or it's just a placeholder until we?
No, we've
the
received
number?
that one,
That's
so
the
that is the
number, right?
confirmed number,
Okay.
yeah. I think normally it's an estimate, but because the budget's further on this year,
Right.
I was able to get that.
Okay, well,
And I guess one other thing to point out on page 61 that, this council, we always have this conversation, we will have this conversation. The transfer from operating fund, was just explained, the transfer to operating fund. Last year, we had a discussion about including $150,000 transfer to operating fund. That's shown here and it's shown as being completed here. What's not shown here, we discussed earlier, is the transfer of any surplus that we have from last year to operating fund. So when we get to that conversation, we can also talk about, so does that mean we do or don't transfer this other transfer, right? Because if we have a surplus in exceedance of $150,000, maybe we don't need to transfer this $150,000. And likewise, we're budgeting again with a recommendation for $150,000. But we can see what happens, if you know what I mean. So we'll get to that when we talk about status of funds, but we're still theoretically shooting to have an operating reserve that provides 6 months of revenue for the town, because that's the guidance from the province. We should try to have 6 months revenue, but we usually can get there by running surpluses. We're just trying to make sure that if we don't, we're still progressing in the right direction. So that's always a conversation when we get into those discussion meetings on the budget, but it's on this page and on status of funds.
So the 6 months of town general expenses is kind of your aspirational target then?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Is that a little over $1 million, 1.2, something like that?
Yeah, and you'll see we're actually getting close. We're getting closer. We've come a ways.
That's awesome.
You look at where we were 5 years ago in terms of operating reserve, we've come a long way.
2.4. So 1.2.
Yeah, and we're getting, well, we're technically moving in the other direction this year, but like I said, that's without factoring the surplus.
I think that's excellent though, to be able to put that number out there because you end up, when you're running surpluses and you're not adjusting tax rates, people would have questions. So the idea that, yes, over the next few years, we have a strategy, a plan, everyone's on side with it, we're trying to build reserves specific to that metric. I think that's, as long as we can communicate that to the public, I mean, that's completely logical.
And it's, the province every year publishes a report on the performance of municipalities, and that's one of the things that they encourage and rate us on and want us to do. And, it's a small thing, don't want to talk about revenue from investments, but having money in reserve does give us a certain level of flexibility on how we use the money in reserve to benefit the community as well.
Operating line, which used to be a small interest rate, now it's more meaningful.
On to fire protection.
Oh, Richard. Now we're talking.
So, as mentioned earlier, so we haven't increased the fire tax rate, but we've also, but we also have broken it out this year. So just a reminder that it used to be in the total, and now it's showing separately in the in the budget for fire. So just kind of a reminder of that.
And there has been the same growth and assessment that applied to general, a smaller portion of it applies to the fire as well. So with no change in rate, we do have some additional revenue coming in.
Dylan, that, pardon me, the line item outside revenue is so based on Mater's Cove and the Mater's Cove meeting, I think we're there at 14.5 cents.
No, 11. 11. We're still 11.
Well, obviously 11 cents.
Yeah.
We thought we were kind of in the 14.
Yeah, we have a higher rate in town.
Higher rate. And is it 11 for Clareland?
Yeah.
Okay, everybody's at 11.
Everybody's at 11 now. And as long as assessment continues to grow, then we don't have any, need to change that. But.
Okay, and then we've allocated, so you'll notice we've allocated the IT services this year. So that is on page.
It comes with some new computers,
Yeah, so
chief and deputy and others.
Yeah, so we put 5% of total services to the fire budget. So that is 2180 this year. The electricity, which let me find the appropriate page.
Before we leave that page,
Yeah,
is there a reason why insurance for firefighters is at 0?
There's a few places where there's a misallocation, And one of the things Ashley's been talking about, you know,
So it's-
making sure that the finance staff who actually plug these items in understand from the information they receive exactly which line item it's destined to. And there have been some miscommunications where things get like lumped together under one line item heading because it seemed like that's where it made sense to put it. And in this case, I think I'm guessing that's what happened to
Yeah,
last year's
so we-
budgeted amount.
So if you
It's
go-
probably that we paid it, but it didn't.
No,
end up here.
it did hit, it did make it here, but that was the case. So we've reallocated under firefighting for us on page 64. So you'll see it there.
Oh, yes, that was that.
Oh, Joyce Firefighting, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Have we,
and that's just to make it clear that it relates to the
Mhm.
service rather than, yeah. Thank you, Ashley. Yeah, I didn't know.
There's a lot to remember.
at what point does the old fire hall and its operating costs revert back to the town and no longer be described or characterized
Yeah,
as
it's
fire?
true that will be within the second quarter of this year.
Yeah.
It essentially, we just have some items that need to be moved, so we've been working with the department to say there will be a drop dead, like turn in your keys, we're done, the move is completed,
Mhm.
and it's coming soon. But obviously it'll be after the grand opening of the new facility.
There's another work concession this weekend for to move more stuff.
Good. Well, it's a lot, I mean, you've been there for a long time, so it's a lot to
Yeah,
do.
I won't be there, but I'm at the fire chiefs convention this weekend.
But notionally, when we're talking to
Start tomorrow.
like Mater's Cove and Indian Point, Oakland, like the fire protection rates.
Yeah, once
Will
they,
not
once
be
they've moved
paying
out,
two
once they're
fire halls.
officially done, the other
No,
fire
right.
hall.
That
One
was-
starts,
Yeah.
one
The
stops.
whole load reverts back to the tax, to the property taxpayer versus the fire
Tax rate.
tax rate.
If we still have it, it's gone on to a different department, yeah.
And this is the first year that we will have a cleaning service at the fire department. So that is a new expense of 24,100. So it's.
And we will have to evaluate the, you know, intended outside use of the facility. Because if we end up at the point where we're not making enough money we could cut that back a little bit. But hopefully it facilitates a pretty robust usage of the community and room and hall by the public, so we'll see where we end up.
And then I think just fuel and electricity has gone up basically because of costs that have gone up, but also because we're now in a larger hall, so.
Yeah, I think down the road, we should look at some of the power you could get to the new fire hall. I know there's a full line of lights that are on 24/7 in the truck bays, which I personally don't think is necessary. So there's power that's being used 24/7 for all these lights that I don't think need to be on a constant basis. I think we can cut back, so.
No, that's great, that's the kind of stuff we'll work out now.
Arthur will be all over that. We'll even get a grant for that.
I think it'll probably take the whole year to fine tune the building operations, like, I know right away they found that, we didn't have the cooling on for bingo at night, it was too hot, that kind of thing, so there's things like that we're working out, yeah.
All right, so let's talk about water.
Can I just ask a
Yes.
question about something that we did? The I just lost the page. On page 62. And the reference to the urban forest master plan at $30,000. What is that covering? $30,000?
So, let me just skip ahead here. Here we go. So that is the development of master plan to guide town's vegetation management, management of town-owned properties, and inform private practices and new developments.
You're talking about the urban forest. master plan?
Yeah,
What's the $30,000 being spent on? It's sort of abstract.
So yeah, so the intention has been that there will be contracted services involved in developing that plan.
Okay.
I think that staff will provide more specific recommendation to council on the scope of those outside services that would be needed. But, we're progressing towards the plan with data collection even now, so there's still work being done now. But there's always been an expectation that there would be outside services needed.
Yeah.
But we'll also want to make sure we don't, throw money at something like this, because you could certainly spend quite a bit without a great result if you're not clear about the scope.
Well, I'm glad that Councillor Wilson raised the question of including some funds for tree planting, so as well as the contract of service.
One quick question for firefighting on page 64. The honorarium chief superintendent, I know I questioned this last year, we had it in the 7,500 last year, we didn't use any, and 7,500 again this year.
So the intention has been that with the new bylaw, there would be essentially a turnover of some actual purchasing authority, delegated authority to the chief. We've got the chief an email address and a phone now, so we're
Yes.
moving in that direction. So once that actually happens, it would be reasonable for the chief, who is actually now doing work that would be normally done by staff and is understood legally and by the CRA and everything, to be an employee of the town, to receive some additional compensation for the duty. If it turns out that that's something that in the final development of the bylaw is not desired, or, I think it's a good practice. I think I would recommend it, but I understand that the department may say, even if there's a bunch of extra work associated with being the chief, we don't want that honoraria. So staff continue to recommend it, though,
I
because
can see some of that.
we're already hearing a lot from the current chief that he spends so much time working on fire business that his own business is suffering.
I know it is.
Yeah. So we want to be fair. It's kind of like you guys as counselors.
And would there be a similar 4.1 cost of living increase in the honorariums, or?
Well, we have with the general honoraria. That's a good question.
Yeah.
There's nothing been done on that. But
Yeah, it's certainly not
Honestly,
automatic.
my own personal opinion, I get part of that, is that I don't think there's a need to increase it.
Because we did do an adjustment recently when CRA changed the way the taxes were being applied, and we increased them to offset the
Tax.
potential additional tax that people pay. So maybe what we do is say next year we should do a review of the level of honoraria rather than doing anything different now.
Yeah, so because I know a lot of the guys are saying that it really killed them income tax wise.
That change? Yeah.
change.
Because see, before we never used to go through the tax, and there was no CRA involved. So,
Poor babies.
But the and other towns are doing the same way we used to do it. Lunenburg still doing it that way. So
Well,
anyway, that's neither here nor there.
CRA is
but-
probably not watching our recording, but I
Yeah.
was.
But that's neither here nor there. But anyway, I don't think we should mess with the honorariums issue.
So if you want to turn to page 68, please. So we had no rate change in the air, but we did increase the budget slightly, basically to account for younger families moving into town. They tend to have children. I know from experience, you use a lot more water when you have children. So not a huge increase, but I wanted to account for a little bit. And then the maintenance of intakes, the annual inspection. So that is, let me just find that for you guys. Okay, so it's on page 70, please.
Sorry, Ashley, what's your assumption around the metered sales of commercial? We kind of reverted back to last year's budget versus the last year's actuals.
Yeah, we basically just assume status quo on it.
Versus the budget. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking there's probably not as much increased use on that side as there would be on residential with.
I think at the time, it was probably an assumption of another, say, 40-unit apartment building that would have come online, which was driving the 176 to 211. Anyway, the law. Look about the wash.
In the
That looks a little heavy to me, but that's just one of a million line items in here.
But it raises an interesting question as to our philosophy about comparing the current budget to the last budget instead of comparing it to the last actual. And what the relative merits of those two are.
Yeah, and I think now we've traditionally compared to the budget, but there certainly is. When I was looking at the numbers, I did try to take into both columns.
Yeah, we always take the last year's actuals into account, but a lot of the time they represent work that we didn't do, that we know that we do need to do. So, you know, we budgeted for something, we didn't do that thing, we still need to do that thing the following year. It's still gonna end up in the budget. It's quite often.
And we'd normally be having this conversation in April or May, and we wouldn't have the benefit of the actuals.
Yes.
Yeah.
So July is.
I mean, we'd like to think we're only 2 months from now, but who knows?
Like in July, when you're in July.
Yeah, that's a fair point too.
There was a transfer from surplus funds actually on that page 69 there. I just wanna, this is just for you to look at, but
Yeah.
I'm wondering if we did spend about $25,000 on leak detection work. And I'm wondering if that ever made it to the water utility. I'm thinking maybe that ended up sticking in general because this would be the line item that would have intended to end up at. So maybe you can just check that. I just want to make sure that the water reserve is the one that takes that cost rather than the operating reserve.
Yeah.
No, we did the work. I just don't see it there.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Okay, yeah, right. We have to stop cleaning. Okay, so then maintenance of intakes, which is on page 70. So that is an annual inspection that hasn't been completed for the last couple of years. So we're hoping that it is completed. So you notice last year only $400 was spent of the 3,000 budgeted. So again, with the cost of everything increasing, I budgeted an extra 1,000 for that, but hoping that that actually does come to light this year.
So that's at Oakland Lake that we're talking about, I guess.
And then just further down on that page, structures and improvements. So there's a $1,000 increase there. So basically there's a new generator and there's an annual service cost of that about $1,000. Okay. And then page 71, Joe's favorite line, chemicals. So we have we're expecting a 20% increase in cost on these chemicals. So it's quite substantial. I know it's over the 10% desired approach for it.
Well, and I guess that's a good point to illustrate that, you know, we talked about keeping expenditures below 10% and we do feel that we did do that,
Yeah.
but in many cases, there was just expenditure growth that was really
Yeah.
not within our means of control.
Yeah.
So other places then had to make up the difference.
Commodity driven.
Yeah.
Exactly, very much so. So we, yeah, like the CEO said, we tried to kind of
Between
account-
policing and chemicals and fuel and, you know, it's just,
But I mean, it doesn't take a lot of in-depth analysis to see that the water utility is gonna, you know, we're not gonna have any visibility on actually even breaking even.
Yeah, and it's,
And we have the highest rates in the country.
this is another break even budget, but we're not really progressing beyond breaking even.
For inside the utility.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we do have a water rate study that is in the special operating initiative, was in council strategic plan. It is time. This year, we had no water rate change. We had a flat, no change year. It is time we look at the trends and determine if future rate increases can be or need to be considered. I know we don't want to see any because, as you say, we have some of the highest water rates. Although this document again presents the comparative cost of owning a property in Mahone Bay and Lunenburg and Bridgewater. And it does show that all other things being equal, despite the water rate increase, we're still offer a competitive cost of service to the other communities. But geez, if we could get the water rate down, we'd be much more competitive.
so that, it's too fine a point on it, that just remind us all that for every liter of water we sell, we pump 3 liters.
Right.
And we were projected to be able to cut our costs by as much as $34,000 through elimination of leaks in the system. So, you know, $34,000 is a pretty considerable amount to be able to save. And I know Scott's really keen on it. Once we can get enough staff there on a regular basis we have an intern now as a military intern with the water system. So, for a few weeks.
I hope there's not too much of a dangerous, but just curious about that process and where we're at, because I think we spent quite a bit of money in that.
Yeah, they're supposed to provide an update report because all of the staff who were involved in that process are no longer with the town.
Yeah.
And we have had a couple of briefings with the consultant who did the report with the existing staff. And Scott just hasn't had the time to actually come around to like, here's what he sees as, because we got great recommendations. What's the way forward this year at leak detection? So there will be a report coming from Scott. We just haven't had the opportunity yet. You know, he's within his first few months still, and James is even newer.
So that report will be coming to council from.
Yeah, yeah. And if there is one or two small operational things in this budget that do have to do with the recommendations from last year's work with the external consultant on what do we need to know. I will say I'm very impressed by how quickly Scott's getting up to speed in terms of how all of the different valves and checkpoints and things in the system work. Because one of the key things to leak detection is being able to isolate different parts of the system in order to test the effects. And there's some interesting discoveries. So we'll, I think it's very true that we've done the right thing in putting a substantial emphasis in our capital program on water, wastewater. It may be that there are some things we could do short of that, but we're also determining some of the, you know, what we knew on paper to be true when you actually go out there and you exercise some of those valves. And clearly the system is not functioning to its 1949 service standard. Like there's some things that are not working the way they're supposed to, and it's indicative of water loss in the system. So we're making progress.
Nice to detect a leak before it starts bubbling through paper.
That would be good.
I mean, the numbers are gonna tell the tale, but you know, I think aspirationally, we made a decision last year that we were gonna, hopefully, that was gonna be the last transfer from operating from the operating reserve into the water utility, or actually the capital reserve into the water utility. And like, it doesn't look to me that that's gonna be easy to do.
It is fully phased out now.
It's phased out now, yeah. I just,
But we're still on the.
I mean, at some point, you wonder about the water bill being like how much higher can we make the water rates
And the
versus.
challenge will really be like, if we get to do all the work that we have planned on the system, we have to borrow for our share of it, then those costs, those borrowing costs still need to be paid by the utility. And fitting that in without a rate increase, you know, is not looking good right now.
It's just like.
The room that was supposed to cover that has gone to increases in chemicals and other
Yeah.
costs.
No, fair enough. Anyway, it's an interesting conversation because to Ashley's point, it's if you have power consumers of the water utility, like boy, oh boy, those numbers really add up. You know, so to the degree that, you know, can you subsidize? And of which is something I've been historically against, but that was always under the impression that inevitably our rate increases will allow us to turn to cash flow neutral, but I mean, can't tilt it that windmill forever.
But it does show, you know, when we have these projected multi-unit developments and things, you know, within the existing catchment, so we don't have to build a bunch of new infrastructure, how much of a difference that can make to the bottom line of the water.
No question.
And then our water testing fees have gone up by $39.20. It's on page 71, just under the chemicals. And that is 11% increase in testing, but also $2,600 for a 5-year GCDWQ sampling. Please don't ask me what that is. I did write it down and I have not memorized that. So that's that. And then you'll notice the answering service and the IT services, again, new line, still on page 71, just an allocation of our overall expenses. And
I guess
Sorry,
like
yeah.
net, like, so we're up, water treatment is up a third in 2 years. Wow, that's a big number.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, let me make sure I can find this for you guys. The janitor expense. There we go, page 74. So again, this is the first year for that. So you're gonna see we're budgeting 5,700 for it. And again, these are costs that were sent to me and then we're allocating them out. So they should be pretty. And then the auditors, same deal. It's on page 74 at the very top under professional fees. So there is an increase because we're also adding in the internal audit internal control audit to their, on a proportional amount of 20% of the total cost. So are there any more questions on water? Lots of information.
Yes, yeah, obviously, lots more questions will likely arise. That's the intention of
Absolutely,
this
yeah,
process.
no, and they're more than welcome. This is my first year, so by all means, any comments, questions, concerns, send them my way.
Yeah, maintenance of general property is 0.
I don't know where those two lines, there's, I think those are supposed to be hidden lines. They unhid and suddenly they're there, but they're 0 across the board. And I
Yeah,
think
those
they're
should be
just-
removed, actually.
Yeah.
They're not even at this point, yeah.
It's not obvious, but there's at least as much hidden information in the spreadsheet that actually works from as there is
Yeah.
printable information.
But the question still remains, so you don't have any maintenance expenses of the property?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a line that we have used, which means that any maintenance expenses associated with the property are being rolled into another category here these days.
Yeah.
They were very minimal, the expense in the property.
19,000 bucks.
Sometimes, yeah, some of the smaller line items have been eliminated over the years, consolidated,
Yeah.
but we often, the easier thing has been to hide than to delete, so there's.
Yeah, that's a newbie error. I apologize for that. So if we're done with water, we can move on to electric.
Sorry, actually, just
Yeah.
one last question on water. So
Absolutely.
that transfer back to the perpetual care fund, that inter-fund loan, that must be almost at the end, eh? We must be at the
Mhm.
tail end of that.
Yeah.
aren't we?
I was just
It doesn't show as having, oh, that one, yeah.
That's just the money that perpetual care fund lent to.
Which when we were talking earlier about, if you have money in reserve, then why not find ways to use it?
Yeah. Versus, anyway.
Mhm.
I always find that when we look at the perpetual care cash balances, doesn't include the loan as an asset.
Hmm.
So if you think about the perpetual care fund having cash and it also has this receivable, which is the loan from the, anyway.
Yeah, you're right.
Which line is that, Joe?
It's the $8,300.
Oh, the 8,300.
It was like
Yeah,
a
okay.
15-year loan. We've been just every year for the last 15 years. We've been drawing down, but I think we're
Yeah.
getting to the end of it
Yes,
soon.
yeah.
So
I
page
forgot
75.
that, yeah.
All right.
Electrical, now we're talking.
Yeah, this gets 2 slides.
It's not a great story.
So we haven't increased the rate. We have decided for the domestic sales, basically all the revenue except for the industrial, we're gonna assume a 3% increase. For industrial, we presume an 8% increase. And so
These are
not,
on rates.
sorry,
No,
These are
this is
on-
fine.
Oh, volume. Perfect.
yeah,
Really?
yeah, sorry, yeah.
On volume.
Yeah, so we haven't increased anything on that. Now, over to the expense side, this is where the story gets a little bit. So on page 78, under expenditures, you can see the power purchase. So this is where we're getting hit. So I spent considerable amount of time talking to Area and going through the spreadsheets and trying to use what they had and forecast where our expenses will be for the remainder of the year. So it looks like we're looking at imported power at a total for the year of 886,000. Last year we budgeted 580. We ended up paying 612. And then Area, we have about a $70,000 increase in that expense. And then the power purchase for SPI, we're just leaving it flat for this year because it's a standby thing and it can be increased, if the lines are frozen to New Brunswick and we need to use their power. So I just wanted to kind of leave that status quo.
Mhm.
But that is driving our not so lovely end product, I guess.
But is that, sorry, sorry.
No,
I was just gonna ask, is this if you think of this as per dollars per KVA or per kilowatt hour,
Yeah,
is this reflected in on the other side in terms of how much power we're selling?
No,
no,
look at page 77, there's no good news there.
yeah,
Yeah, no, this is straight up the same power at a much higher cost.
yeah.
And what was essentially being projected here is the fourth quarter, so we're under a contract now with a fixed price that would have been determined in the spring of 2021. So that contract ends on December 31st of this year, and the projections are this huge increase. This is almost just that fourth quarter increase.
Yeah, and
So
if
this
you,
would look even worse if this was all the full year. This is not even the full year.
yeah,
Well,
So this is rate increases from our wholesalers.
Yes,
Yes.
well, yeah, well, they're anticipated. We haven't locked into a contract or anything.
and higher fixed cost in area, obviously.
And those, essentially, I mean, Ash just got at the bottom of the slide up on the screen there, but we've presented a deficit budget here, essentially because what we're doing is we're presenting the current rates. But we've also written to the board and let them know, if council has planned to do it, we've approved it, we'll be filing a rate study with the board. So we have a discussion to have here at our next meeting, presumably, or the one after that. We're going to need to revise this electric budget before it's final. And there's some question about, do we put rates in, do we put revenues in on a projection of increased rates? Or do we budget a deficit and then go to the board and say, look, if you don't do anything, this is where we end up. But whatever the case, whether it shows as a deficit or shows as an increased rate, we know that for the customer, this budget is representing an increase in cost to the average consumer. Like, we're going to have to pass on some of this cost. We can, if council, in our discussion, we can tighten it up as much as possible. We'll never get down to a balanced budget within the electrical utility this year without increasing rates.
Well, relative, so it's all about relativity to your alternatives. And I think like NSP's already publicly saw it, I think an 11% increase in rates, so. That which we put their rate relative to.
Yeah, I think there'll be a solid analysis, but I think no matter which way we go right now, the costs are projected to go up like this. Now, one advantage for us is the costs where the market has gone have now already shot up beyond the purchase price associated with our solar garden, which is a relatively fixed price. So at least we know that when that comes online, it will
Some
actually
will
provide cheaper power than whatever power it's displacing by the time it comes online. And that's a great story for our residents. In addition to it being renewable energy, it's going to be substantially below market because market is just going up and up and up. So, but yeah.
And we will be able to demonstrate the changing cost comparisons between what our clients receive and what they would have received. It was strictly an NSPI driven market.
Yeah, we will be able to show that, but for the time being, we're being, the rate increase we're gonna feel, and we'll have to decide how it is best borne across the customer base. It is certainly going to be similar, I think, to the kind of cost increases that NSPI is looking at. I mean, we're all susceptible to the world market, and the more energy generation we have of our own, the less susceptible we'll be.
So would it be possible in these numbers to just show our blended average sale price per megawatt hour?
Yeah.
And our blended average purchase price from each supplier per megawatt hour, just so we know
Well, yeah.
what the rates are, what the rate differentials are.
I think in order to get that back, we'll have to get some assistance from area. So whether we have it for the next budget meeting or potentially the one after, we will get that information. I'm not sure if we'll have it for the 14th. We might have to defer the electric utility to the following one.
I guess the area, like the NSPI number is really the tariff versus, like, we're not buying any power from them.
that's the standard.
That's just the standby
Yeah.
tariff.
Yeah.
Right, so you have to, that's a fixed cost now
Exactly.
versus like a power purchase number. So
Yeah.
I think this is a legacy off of our historical, like way we've historically organized the numbers. But I mean, I think Kelly, to get to the number, your true gross margin X units of revenue of X units of power and X units of expense for the power, like we would net the 330 out to give you a more realistic like gross margin, because right now it's like what, 3%, 5% now, actually, it's a low number.
Yeah.
I guess the point is the 333 is not correlated to power per se, it's the tariff charge that
There is a fixed
Yeah.
charge. Is there any variable? Because last year's actual was less,
So,
something,
Yeah, I
it's
mean, the
proportionate to
330
something is.
yeah,
fixed.
the 333 is basically the majority of the standby, so should we not be able to obtain power from New Brunswick, that's when NSPI steps in, so, there is a slight variance.
super small.
Yeah, there is a little bit there, but, we're basically paying to have NSPI in standby, should we not be able to obtain
So-
power elsewhere.
So let me understand, if we don't buy, if it happens that we didn't buy any power from NSPI, we still pay that fee?
Yes.
It's the
So
fee associated with using their transmission
Yeah, this is-
infrastructure, which comes with a backup service.
Yeah,
Okay,
That's
okay,
right.
but I still think it would be helpful to know how much we're buying from
Hmm.
MV and how much we're paying for it.
Mhm.
And I don't see how you can come up with that number in the budget without knowing that.
so I have a massive spreadsheet that I
I
can.
thought you knew.
It probably would put most of you to sleep if I brought it out right now, but that's certainly something that I can,
I mean, I think that'd be really helpful, because next year when we have, or the year after, when we have solar garden volume capacity, you would see the displacement of the
yeah,
90 cents a kilowatt or $90 kilowatt being replaced by solar garden at 75. Like you'd be able to see that in the
Yeah.
financials that you
Yeah.
can't see now. So like cutting to the chase, like I'm afraid to flip the page, but I'm assuming we have a multiple $100,000 operating deficit, right?
Would you like the exact amount?
Just
save your travel time.
Anyway, that's capital too, right? So this is just operating one.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, in our conversation with council, like you can see, there are some line items where we have in the past certainly been tighter. We're looking at, this budget presents like, let's get out there and do all the vegetation and all the other things.
Yeah.
There are options to cut back. We shouldn't be in that mode right now. That's not, but given what's happening in the market, if we want to not be fully dependent on an increase in rates, we may get some direction from council, tighten up that deficit so that we're not going to the board to pass on 100% of the increased cost of power to our residents. Maybe we can absorb a little bit, but anything that we absorb, anything we don't pass on, just comes at the expense of necessary costs for, doing vegetation maintenance and reinvesting in our system and all the other things that we haven't spent as much in the past as it is, evident that we need to do. And you go around town, you can see, we've done vegetation maintenance, we've done a little bit more over the last 2 years, but the cost of it, the manner of our doing it, it's only going to be a higher price every year. If we cut it back, what it means is not doing the necessary maintenance. Would residents rather pay the full cost and have the necessary maintenance done, or maybe save a little bit and not do the maintenance? Those are conversations we'll have to have, for sure.
Question about distribution capacity, excuse me. Employee benefits going from 2021 at $20,000 to a budget of 54, so nearly triple. Is that reflecting the cost of Riverport being absorbed into our benefits program?
Which line? Oh, sorry, you're looking at from
Page
2021?
78, page 78.
Yeah.
Where are we?
Distribution.
The 2020 to,
Fourth line down on
so the
distribution.
actual last year was 29.
Yes,
So yeah, that would be,
more than about double.
yeah.
Well, about double last year's actual.
Yeah.
Yes, so that would include the absorbing river report, yeah. And also there's an allocation of some salary, 20% of the environmental salary in there as well. So that would be the offsetting benefits as well. Yeah.
Because that raises another large series of questions.
Is that correlated to note 1, Ashley, on 77? the 32 from Riverport? Or is that the revenue coming for the truck?
No, that would be operating.
That's
I mean,
operating, yeah.
we kind of ran into the same issue last year, is like,
Yeah.
we don't have an agreement with Riverport, but there's a number of things that are subject to an agreement. How do we reflect the impact of that agreement? We're not going to reach an agreement that is going to be entirely one-sided. So there is some quantification of what cost Riverport should be
Bearing.
put, things they should pay back to the town.
Yeah, so we doubled it for this year, assuming there is something that will be signed, and then it's offsetting the salaries and benefits on the other side.
But we won't be assuming any costs in association with this proposed agreement until the agreement is reached.
Yes.
So council will certainly want to put something in the budget, because we do want to reflect that this is where we're discussing going. Yeah.
So I'll confess, I'm very naive about all that stuff. But the way it looks to me right now, we are absorbing some expenses without any income.
There is an income line, Ashley, it's on the previous page, is it?
Yeah.
Where's revenue?
Page 77, note 1.
Thank you, Joe.
It's very handy to have right here.
So that's non-operating revenue.
Oh. It shouldn't be. Oh, because it's non-operating revenue, because it's not coming from the operation of the utility, but it is going to support operation. So non-operating revenue here is not like non-operating revenue in water. This money is going into fund operations. It's just coming from sources other than the operation, I guess. Because there's interest on overdue accounts, and that's,
I'm a late bloomer, so that-
we should fix something there. I see where you're coming from, Francis. If you think about what is non-operating revenue, usually that would mean what is it going to fund as opposed to where is it coming from? And in this case, it's just going into general revenue for the electric utility, so it's not going somewhere non-operational.
But I think this is denoting the source of the revenue.
Yeah, but it's in water, we use the term non-operating the other way around in the water utility, so it is confusing.
Try to standardize that something.
I guess the takeaway, Ashley, is that you're booking the transfer for a basket of odds and ends, one of which is this new benefits package that the towns, and notionally, we're at least a cent better off. We're favorable.
I mean, we actually do overall have an expectation that the partnership with Riverport involves the town paying Riverport slightly more than they would be paying us.
Yeah.
Because we have been getting some benefits from Riverport's manager doing work on behalf of the town in an informal sense to be formalized by the agreement, right? And that's even
Yeah.
reflected in our org chart where Nancy, who is the Riverport manager, is doing our scheduling and our standby and other things on behalf of the town
Yeah,
right
it's an
now.
$8,000 difference, so from receivable versus what we're paying to them, we're paying about $8,000 more. Assuming what, like Dylan said, what Nancy's doing now, that we would be kind of already capitalizing on, so.
That needs some storyboarding around, if I'm a taxpayer, people will just ask, why am I subsidizing?
Yeah, and I don't know, the best way to describe it is that like the town electric utility and Riverport Electric Light Commission both need management services within the operation of our utility. Neither of us is in a position to actually have a full-time manager. So in this case, the manager is actually an employee of the Riverport Electric Light Commission, and they provide management services to the town for which we would compensate them. And essentially, we neither of us needs or can afford to have a full-time manager. We're sharing in that cost. We're sharing in it in this case by us contributing to their employee. And that's subject to an agreement that we haven't actually reached with them at this point. But practically speaking, we both know that we need some management services for our utilities.
But an interesting corollary to that will be, if that comes to fruition, Dylan's salary is currently allocated to the electrical utility, which is, I don't know what percentage, but it's some, will be repatriated and go onto the town's website, I assume.
Because the management activity would be
Done by Nancy.
Yeah, there is some potential for that. I mean, there's a number of different things that will change. Like right now, we also allocate finance department costs to our electrical utility, but our electrical utility would save some of that money because some of the functions being performed for the electric utility by the finance department would be on behalf of Riverport, which means that would actually reduce the cost to our utility to compensate the finance department for services provided. So
But-
shift one thing to the
Assuming,
next and the
like,
next. You know.
the arrangement and formality around the Riverport partnership is something that you're working on. That's.
And the council has entrusted to the Shared Service Advisory Committee,
Yeah.
which Kelly's the rep along with myself. And we've had 5 meetings, I think, so far in the past couple months. So we're definitely working towards the draft that will eventually be presented to
I'm a
council.
little worried, you didn't seem very busy recently.
We needed another committee.
Add that on your pile of other things.
We have a
Anyway.
meeting with White Pine.
Gotcha. Well, okay, well, this is the benefit of the next meeting being on the 14th. We get all this time to soak up all this information, so that's good. Anyway, it's a pretty dire situation on the electrical utility. It does make you wonder about how other utilities who don't have the benefit of like an operating reserve, well, no, not, I mean, just the support of a bigger entity and a tax base.
So still a layman's question is that we will have a almost 250,000 deficit. That's what
Operating, yeah,
suggested.
plus capital.
Yes, which I think capital is reflected later in here to come out of existing capital funds, so it is all to be covered, but
But yeah.
there's a lot of
You think
capital
about the
as
cash
well.
flow.
We're taking a big hit on the capital side as well, because there's a lot of costs associated with that. But Francis, to this deficit is based on existing rates.
Yeah.
And then the question becomes how much of that should be borne by rate increases to the customer, yeah.
Well, I think the other thing, Dylan, not to get off on a tangent, this is why we're doing the solar guard. Like, this is why, to make that 333 from NSP a lower number. Like, we have less,
Well, and the
you know.
333 specific, so the solar guard would displace energy that's currently being purchased on the market. So it would displace some of that increased NV power purchase, or whoever we bought it from. We could buy it from anybody, it doesn't have to be NV power. But then there's also the fixed costs associated with using NSPI's transmission infrastructure.
Right.
We are currently, thankfully, we've got some funding through the Department of Energy, through area, to study how we can improve our capacity, which would in turn reduce our requirements to pay NSPI for backup capacity. So based on the regulator's decision, we have to have deployable capacity resources, whether that's gen sets that can be turned on, burning fuel of some sort, or batteries that can store energy. We're going to need to make investments. This applies to all the area units. We're going to need to make investments in actual infrastructure that will be intended to offset that dependence on Nova Scotia Power for capacity. That's separate from solar guard investment. So solar guard investment is targeted at displacing the imports. Battery or generation equipment, that's going to be a separate investment that has yet to be the conclusion of every study as to what is the best balance of batteries, where should they be located, generation assets, where should they be located. Obviously, the classic thing for generation assets is burning diesel. We don't really see how that's consistent with the town's environmental program, although we should emphasize these assets would not actually need to be used. They just have to exist, which is a strange, but Summerside is a bunch of diesel generators. It's not like they run their diesel generators, they just have them.
Just to displace just to show the URB that we have a backup.
Demonstrated capacity of our own, yeah.
Because NSPI is maintaining the capacity to provide that backup.
Yeah.
And that's what we're really paying them for, whether we actually use it or not.
25 grand a month. Just.
And then there's certainly like a nice energy security angle to the town if, natural disasters and things, like to our ability to keep our grid running under our own power if we so chose to do so. I mean, there's some value to that too.
Well, definitely to the commercial market as well. You think if you're.
Yeah, we don't get disruptions commonly now, but in the future, who knows how common disruptions in power supply from the provincial grid might become, if we're planning ahead.
All right, and then a few more expenses to note. We're also looking to hire another contract services for another vegetation individual to manage the vegetation, the tree removal, et cetera. So similar to Public Works, the estimate's about $18,000 for that. Now, they did have someone that no longer works there, and based on market now, looks like it's about 3 times the cost, so.
So this isn't just a change in cost, though, this is a change in scope. I mean, we've had a lot of discussions about
Yeah,
what does tree trimming look like in town, and we know that the way that it has happened has not always met service expectations.
exactly, so this, yeah.
There
the
is an
expectation
attendant
would
cost
be-
to a higher expectation, and yeah,
Absolutely.
we will be going to market for a provider, so I certainly don't want to say that, you know, we had a contract and we're now we don't hire that person. We're just going to market for a different scope of services.
Yeah.
And we'll welcome bids from any different providers that could meet that expectation of the scope of services.
Well said. Grow load initiatives, we're looking at about $12,000 a year as an annual expense.
So we have now for the past several years looked for opportunities to support the increase of, so people basically switching from fossil fuels. And that's one of the ways that the utility targets to grow demand is, even if the all other things being equal, the need for energy was the same, a larger proportion of it could be electric versus fossil fuels within the community. And whenever we look for studies or programs or pilots, that's the budget we've typically gone into. And now that we've been doing that for several years, we're suggesting that it would be a typical ongoing thing, that there will, every year, there will be more efforts to bring fossil fuels over. You look at the balance of energy supply of the community, there's more growth to be had in fossil fuel conversion to electricity than in new development, really. I mean, especially when you talk about transportation. If everybody in town had an electric vehicle, they charge them at night, we'd see a 30–40% increase in our power demand, like it just right away. So I mean, that's huge.
And within other expenses, we're looking at about $12,500 for new clothing and necessary new clothing. And the rate study is going to cost us around $16,000.
I believe how expensive shock rated clothing is.
Right? Yeah, I think there's
$90
expiry. Yeah, I think that there's expiry dates on them, and they
Yeah.
need to be. Yeah, I'm learning all kinds of new things about this stuff. And then just on page 80, I just wanted to point out that the auditors, again, the audit's gone up from 6,900 last year to 16,000, and that would include the internal controls audit as well. And this is for electrical, so we're proportioning it based on 30%, I believe. And then the IT services, same thing. So this is a new line for this year. And actually IT services and the finance software and hardware are both new lines for this year because, again, as I mentioned, we're allocated them to the different utilities.
And that IT services is another one of those things we talk about, like what is the package of things that we rebuild to Riverport? Like Riverport is currently being served by our IT services now. You know, in practice, the intention is that as we move forward with the partnership, all the IT costs would be coming under that one umbrella, and Riverport would be paying into that. So they're offsetting revenue.
So another naive question. So my understanding would be the internal control audit that was in general government is 13,000, and then now there's another 16, maybe less than that in there.
Mhm. So
For the utility, because I remember when Dylan was talking about the internal controls and the auditor's report, he mentioned much of that was driven by things arising from the electrical side of things.
Yeah.
And that being a concern. So are we double, just, I guess as a layperson, are we double dipping in some extent or double accounting?
What's the actual cost
actual
of the, yeah.
all right.
If the actual cost is the total of the two utilities and the general contribution, so it's like a $20,000 item, then that makes sense. And that will be what's being presented to the audit committee when the audit committee meets the week after next. That will, you'll get the actual Deloitte proposal. I think actually that'd be the proposal from Deloitte with the audit committee.
So I can give you a little bit of information on that right now. Should just open. Okay, so our proposed audit for the entire 100% is 21,800, and then our internal controls audit is 27,300. Yeah.
So that's being split. So
So-
basically half of it is borne by the town.
Half of it's the town, 20% is water, and 30% is electrical. So I base those based on how we divide other expenses as well. And that, you know, a lot of internal controls are also gonna be, you know, in the finance area and how we're dealing with it. So-
Inventory is only one part of the.
Exactly, so it's, I think that's a fair division of percentage, so I don't think we're double dipping, I think it's basically, I also included otoscope cost of 7,000, so the total 56,1 is divided amongst the 50, the 20, and the 30, so 30 going to electrical. So if you wanted the actual numbers, it's gonna be 50% to town, which is 28,050, 20% to water, which is 11,220, and 30% to electrical, which is 16,830, and that totals 56,100. Does that help?
It does. It's just a concern. I mean, I know we need those controls, but that's a lot of money we're spending. on
It is a
audit.
lot of money, and there was a range that they provided us, and I picked sort of on the higher end, and, you know, it's based on hours and what they find. And the thing with an internal control audit as well is we want to be careful because we are a small, you know, operation. So something that, you know, may be applicable to a larger operation may not even be feasible for us to deal with. So
The boilerplate recommendation for the internal controls probably doesn't fit Mahone Bay's operation.
exactly, so there's gonna be a lot of making sure that the time they're spending and the hours that they're billing us is appropriate, as opposed to just kind of being like, okay, well, here's our checklist and let's just apply it to here. So there's gonna be, I know I'll be asking a lot of questions before the audit even starts, just to ensure that they're modifying it for exactly, you know, our finance team of 3 people, you know, 4 people. So the bill very well could be less. I just kind of wanted to, worst case scenario.
But just a heads up, it will come to auditing and finance. I'll be very curious to have that conversation, because I'm not convinced based on the last conversations you had that the farm we're thinking of getting is the farm that should do that work.
Good conversation for audit and finance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I love the fact that you're saying your last questions, you'll be very sure about what they're doing vis-a-vis what they're billing us for.
Absolutely, yeah, especially where we're small and we don't want to be billed for things that's the same thing with the audit too. You know, I want to make sure that what they're looking at is appropriate for our size and materiality, so. My old auditing days will come out. And then if we go to cemetery budget.
And we already highlighted these because they do
Yeah,
come back to what the grant.
Exactly, so this is mostly what you've seen before, but as I mentioned, in one of the prior slides, the park cemetery does have an increase of 3,000 for stone repair. Sorry, there we go, and then the baby cemetery, $20,000 for anticipated tree removal. So, and those are gonna be reflected in grants from the town.
Actually, just regarding, I guess, park to start, so like by policy, our perpetual care, sale of lots goes directly to the perpetual care fund.
Yes.
So, and then I think how you've got this illustrated in the budget, you can see the gap that it just simply goes down below, the transfer below.
Yeah.
So what's the plan for 2021, 2022 with the surplus? Are we just topping up the transfer to reflect the 9,100? Or are we going to do the 4,500 plus the 11,000?
It's a great question.
Anyway, maybe just take that, you can just take that away.
Okay, yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah. So the surpluses from last year were to be transferred into reserve.
The surplus plus the 4,500.
Yeah, so rather than reducing the grant from the town,
Yeah,
we were leaving the grant for the town where it was, and we were putting the surplus into reserves,
gotcha.
just as a way to juice those reserves, basically.
Yeah, we
To-
want to work
to-
towards building them
build
and have them, you know,
Okay.
self-sustaining, so.
And the town had already budgeted for a contribution, so, you know.
Yeah, fair enough.
All right, and then the last couple slides I have on here before we go into sort of the capital projects and all that good stuff is.
We'll mostly leave for you to look over for next time. given the
Yeah,
hour.
exactly. These are just the grants, the subsidies, and the tax exemption. The tax exemption's only changed by one seasonal business that is no longer running, so we just went down from 4 to 3. So that's all I have for presentation
We
wise.
previously approved the grants, and what we've done here is we basically just rounded up a little bit to
Yeah.
allow just a little buffer for late breaking requests.
Exactly. So now if we want to get into the. Fine, where it is exactly. So did you want to go into the special projects or the capital projects?
We just quickly go through special operating.
Yeah.
Starting on page 86. So these are all, actually, do you mind I just speak to these ones?
Nope.
These are
By
all
all means.
already reflected in the line item detail that Ashley has provided. So none of these are additional, they're all already in there. We just break them out here because they relate specifically to council's strategic objectives. These are really the meat of council's strategic plan, is to say, there's some extra stuff, strategic stuff we need to do. It's gonna have a cost associated. Because it's extra, because it's one time, because it's unusual, those costs are borne by the operating reserve. And we've got a well-funded operating reserve, and that's where these costs are allocated. So essentially what we've got is the municipal planning strategy, land use bylaw update. We talked about that, but accessibility audits. So essentially in operationalizing our commitments to accessibility under the Lunenburg County Plan, we actually have to go out and do audit gap analysis on certain town assets and generate the recommendations for capital improvement that come out of that. That's the last step of our journey towards an accessibility operational plan. We've got the cemetery natural asset mapping work. We talked about that's ongoing now with the grant. On the next page, we've got Edgewater Main Street engineering. So staff were directed to bring this recommendation to budget. We previously presented council with a recommendation to do a study and engineering options design around the intersection of Main and Edgewater and various controls of pedestrian and vehicle access. Council referred that by motion to the budget process. That's included here. We can have some discussion when we get to the discussion meetings on the budget. I strongly recommend this item. We said we referred to budget, so it's in here, but I understand from council that referred to budget doesn't necessarily mean accepted. New logo development, that was already directed by council. Urban Forest Master Plan is a carryover from the prior year, but it has not been intended to take place until this year to be completed next year. That's always been the timeline established by council strategic plan, so we're not late on it. Similar with the housing strategy development, it was intended to be completed by next year. So that's in here as well. And car share program design, council recently considered a couple of months ago, last year's budget had an item for the purchase of an electric vehicle. That was intended primarily for staff and council use, but it was also to have a car share component so public could use it to get test drives and get used to the notion of their second vehicle purchase being an EV. Council at that time directed staff instead to focus on the development of a car share program, working with the Climate and Environment Committee. So we would like to seek low carbon communities funding, 75% funding. This represents the 10% that would be needed to basically to kick in the town share towards that project. So we can talk more about that as well. And then on the next page, page 88, there's just, these are for utility special projects. There's just one in each, water rate study and electric rate study. So we've already talked tonight about the importance of doing those rate studies and what that means in terms of the next 3 years or so projections for the utilities. It's important to have at this time. So I just thought I'd run through the operating initiatives. Because they're coming from council strategic plans, not Ashley's area. Do you want to talk about the next? It's very tiny for some reason.
It's
Yeah.
very tiny.
We'll fix that in the digital version, but do you want to talk about that? Because that's always kind of I guess, an important introduction to the capital.
Yeah, so we're looking at, so you see, so towards the bottom here, the contribution to the town operating reserve, that's what Dylan was referencing earlier, where because we have a surplus from last year, we may not necessarily want to contribute that 150 as well. It'll just depend on where we fall once everything is, I guess, once the numbers are actually solidified.
But essentially, this sheet is to summarize, dedicated capital funding the council has in the past
Yeah.
ensured will go into reserve.
So is this based on a second transfer of a second 150,000 from capital to operating? Or with the basis of we didn't do it last year
No, this would be based on the notion that we did do it last year and we would do it again.
to try to get to the 1.2?
Yeah, but we could look at whether we would do it again when we get to the year end from last year.
You all know this is gonna help the dime for me, but I'm, whatever, we can.
Well, in the
we'll talk
past,
about it some more.
we kind of have found that
Yeah.
we don't need to do it as long as we continue to generate surpluses, and that's what we found in the past.
Let's just, and you've heard my rant on this many times, so I won't bore you tonight, but it's just, this, again, to reiterate, the 605, this revenue stream is unique to Mahone Bay. This is like what separates us from other communities, the fact that we don't fund capital and we don't fund the debt on the capital, the interest from the tax rates. We fund it from these other revenue streams. And that is, we're a unique and the only community in the province that finances capital this way. And so therefore, that only works if you have capital, in the reserve to fund your project. But anyway, you've heard my rant before.
So I don't think we're going to go through all of the capital projects as I see on the following pages, and they're again very tiny. We'll fix that in digital version. And if you want a new printout of the digital version, once we send it out, I'm sure we can arrange for you guys to get a new paper copy that doesn't need a magnifying glass. But we always have a tremendous number of capital projects. They represent a very good knowledge of our assets that we've developed, and so there's a lot of good recommendations here. We'll have a discussion during the budget process. If you have any questions that you come to on your own concerning these, please do send them along.
Yeah, and I think you'll notice we broke out this year wastewater. We broke that out separately, so that's a new section.
Yeah, wastewater's always been scattered throughout general, and we just thought, in preparation for better understanding where the capital money goes, let's try to isolate wastewater and show, people wonder where their infrastructure charges go, for example. That is included there,
It would be lovely to have that in larger font.
Especially at this time of night, right?
Is that number,
Absolutely.
is it the number from the area dividend, is that a number that they've provided? That area's provided us the heads up?
The 96 or the
The
140?
96, yeah.
The 96 is what I've calculated based on discussions with area. And I
Based
ran
on
it,
next year's.
correct, and I ran it past them and they were happy with
I
it.
just want to be like, we don't have to get too in the weeds tonight. We just absolutely have to make sure that that dividend is not coming from, that payment is not part of a construction dividend.
No,
Which
it's
is-
not,
okay.
yeah. But I mean, it still speaks to your points about areas cash flow and the management of dividends and all that.
Anyway,
Not a construction dividend, no.
okay. Because I think, on the back of a napkin, I'd say the ability to support the 150 is directly correlated to the 96 showing up.
Yeah.
If we came to the conclusion that the 96 would be more appropriately left in area, then it
Well,
would
in
be
practice last year
reasonable.
too, the way the deed transfer went last year was that, that's
Amazing.
an unusual circumstance.
And the gas tax too.
So we'll be getting a digital copy of this, I'm assuming.
Absolutely.
So
And maybe a magnifying glass.
Yes.
I would say don't print one for me.
Just send out the
Just if you-
digital.
if they get the
Just the
digital,
electronic. Don't print one for me because I can read it fine.
And another strange request, I don't know if this would work, but one of the things I was thinking about is when having a column at the end that shows a percentage increase or decrease in that
Yeah.
particular
Absolutely.
item would be very helpful. to just be able to fix stuff at a glance.
Do you want that budget versus budget or budget over actual or both?
Of actual.
Over actual?
Yeah.
Okay. I accept all ideas and we can make this sort of a lot more user friendly and. Yes, thank you.
So on a very practical level, I'm curious about the amount of white space on the paper and why there weren't more little sections. I mean, like this could have had 3 of these sections on one page.
I think it's just the time allotted to put it together
It's just a
and.
Formatting question.
Yeah, it's a formatting.
Right now, the way we send it to the printer, get technical with the way we send it to the printer, but
Okay.
we send the whole workbook to the printer. And so every sheet in the workbook has to have its printer formatting
I
done.
see.
The first time it goes, invariably, it doesn't come out the way you're expecting. And we didn't have the opportunity to run different options for it. We will though, I mean, we'll make sure that the electronic version that has the correct zoom can be printed with the correct zoom. We will do
Yeah,
that.
absolutely. Apologies for that.
Well, I personally like having a print copy, so.
Yeah, so do I.
Yeah, once the electronic version's out, if you want a printed copy, just request one and we can
And
do
if
it.
it's just the latter part where it is small, like it seems like I feel like the rest of the document is quite readable. It's just that last, the capital section is we.
Dylan, is that new pumper truck line item? That's a newer number. Is that our best guess of, is that our most recent information?
That is the most recent information, but I mean, there is nuance around what we want, right? So the department has been clear about what they want. And I think it will be more expensive than what we had projected, partially because it is a different scope, but partially because time has passed and prices are increasing. So that,
I know the basic price of just a chassis like that has gone up something like $100,000
Yeah.
in the last little while.
so we may have an opportunity to purchase something that would be cheaper, but it would have to be acceptable to the department as well. And I think there's gonna be some back
And a
and
lot of what
forth.
we have in there is needs, not just wants.
So this is this number, which is materially higher than the number we've had the last few years, this is our best guess today.
As
Of
a-
course.
Yeah, based on the scope that the
Wow.
department has provided, yeah.
Quite a lot.
But again, there are some potentials for cost savings, but it would be something that the department would have to be comfortable with. So we'll have over the next few weeks, we're making some progress on this front, but it doesn't necessarily result in a cheaper product, yeah. Probably all I can say for now.
Okay, wow, that's a big number.
So actually, are there, in terms of takeaways, we haven't provided here the closed session information.
Correct.
We will want to get that out to council soon so that people aren't speculating in the background, even if we're not gonna have the closed session until the 14th.
Yeah,
We'll provide council with a synopsis of the personnel recommendations that are included. And likewise, I guess, is there anything else that you want to, we've gotten a couple of requests for follow-up by the next meeting, which is good.
yeah.
We're gonna fix the formatting of this and make it
Yeah, and I
doable.
mean, I think if there's any questions or, suggestions, by all means, send them me, please, and I will do my best to get to them before our next meeting. And like I said, this is, the way that I presented this year, I know is different than prior years, and I think next year, even if I stick with the slides, there'll be adjoining page numbers. So, but if you guys have any recommendations or you prefer it the prior way, let me know. This is for you, so I can amend to help.
I will say that I know you didn't speak to it and I don't, you presented it in a certain way, but I love pages 14, 15, and 16, which we didn't talk about, which is the status of funds. Because once you get to the end of talking about all the other stuff, it all ties together, status of funds. I know Joe loves the status of funds part also.
It used to be page 69, and now we've moved it all out to page.
Yeah, it's what you're at the front now, right?
I'm just kidding. Excellent.
But I think those are some key synopsis,
Yeah.
they bring everything together and, year over year changes and what's happening with the reserves and everything, so. And include even a couple of graphs and things, which I think are quite handy to understanding the effect of this budget on our big picture, multi-year financial situation. So I just wanted to emphasize those. And then it's kind of a weird thing to say, but pay no attention to page 17, please. Of course, you're all gonna want to read it now.
Oh, yeah, please ignore that.
Okay.
It hasn't been updated. So just know, page 17 is straight out of the previous year budget
Yeah.
presentation. It does
Yeah.
not apply currently. It hasn't been adjusted or updated.
Well, it
We
doesn't
didn't
even have
mean
a
to
page
provide
number.
council with an
There
update.
you go. It doesn't even exist.
There you go. Yeah.
How, so the next meeting's a week from tomorrow.
Yeah.
I'm assuming, like, we're not all gonna mass emailing Q and questions and answers. How do you want to facilitate the next, getting ready for the next meeting? Do you want questions early, or do you want just
I would
randomly
say,
by email? Or?
yeah, if you want to email me questions, that'll give me an opportunity to look into them. So the sooner the better, just then I have time to come to the meeting with the answers and the amendments and whatever needs to be done. So absolutely. I mean, if you have questions the day of, ask them. But if you have them beforehand, please email them to me and.
I think we'll say that the focus on the 14th is going to be on the general budget before digging into the utility budget. So if you're thinking about where to put your focus on questions on the general budget first, because we probably won't get in that first session all the way through all the discussion. We have 2 discussion meetings that are scheduled. So just, yeah, in terms of where to put a focus on.
Just going back to the deputy mayor's questions about those categories with their weird titles. I know that somewhere we do have a breakdown of everything that's included in those.
Yeah, so that'll
categories.
be provided.
Yes,
Yes,
that would be
that's-
helpful, and then it would help stimulate the creative juices as we think of other newer, better titles for those.
Yes, I mean, the other thing we can do too is the titles, like even just the titles for the actual budgets, I could put in brackets below what the province has asked for, and we could do something
Yeah.
a little more that makes sense for
Yeah,
us,
yeah.
and as simple as that, and then, yeah, anything throughout that's.
Or just hide the line with the provinces. I think.
Yeah, exactly, so but anything throughout that you guys, you've seen this a lot more than I have even, so by all means, any and every question and thought and idea, send it my way, and I welcome it, so.
Careful what you wish for.
I can handle it, maybe. But thank you all, I appreciate your time, and hopefully I've given you lots to think about, and there's a lot of numbers, so.
Like we were talking about this a little bit like a hazing. It's a trial by fire to start the new manager off with presentation of a budget. So thank you very much, Ashley, for tonight.
Indeed, thank you, Ashley.
It's my pleasure.
It's, some of us have seen these budgets for quite a few years, and this one seems to make more sense and easier to understand and go through, especially with page numbers, than prior iterations of the budget, so.
There's gonna
Thank
be
you
so
for
many
that.
references to page numbers next year as well.
Yeah.
Ease of viewing, so.
So we will meet again on July 14th, which is a week from tomorrow. And if you have questions that can help with the session on the 14th, please direct them to Ashley. She has suggested sooner rather than later would be preferable and very much understandable. Is there anything else?
So Dylan mentioned that the next one's gonna be basically onto the general operating.
Yes.
So should we base our questions to that more so than? in the
If you
other
get
areas?
into the others and you want to send
My
along
gosh,
questions,
yes,
that's
I'm
great.
along.
Send them
I just,
along.
if you're pressed for time over the next week, we could always say that the focus will be on general to start with, But if you've got questions and, some of you may really get into the electrical, I know that's great, and we'll send
If
those
you
along
have
too.
burning questions, by all means, send them along.
Okay. Deputy CAO, do we have some folks at home
Yes,
playing the home game?
we have 6 people watching now, but we have no questions in the gallery.
Okay, I would ask those 6 people if they do have a question about anything that was discussed tonight, to take an opportunity to ask that question now. We'll give them a minute or so for it to process through. Okay, before we look for an adjournment.
Your Worship, if I may, while people are coming up with those questions. Then this budget tonight was presented to council, and as we've gone through this meeting, obviously a lot of things have been noticed. So it will be put on the website as the meeting package for tonight's meeting after staff have an opportunity to adjust some of those things that came up at this meeting. So
Okay,
the draft budget isn't there yet, but once we get some of those hiccups out, then that will be put up there. So this again, tonight was just to present this budget to council, so.
So by the time the meeting on the 14th happens, members of the public who are super keen will also have been able to
see.
go through the whole document, and if they have things they're looking out for in the discussion on the 14th.
And will the creative size of text be adjusted before the version goes on to the?
That's some of
Yes.
what we need to fix.
Absolutely.
A couple other little notes that got left off and stuff like that.
Our 2020, 2021, 2021 numbers, are those financials posted on the website?
Yes.
There.
We do have one
Yeah.
issue on the website that there's only something to open if there's something there to see. And of course, especially with the COVID and a lot of things going online and that kind of thing, you know, there weren't fuel charges. People weren't driving to Halifax for an NSFM meeting, they joined it online and that kind of thing. So there are a lot of spaces where there's just nothing to pull up. So,
So you're just saying, well, if somebody goes to the financial section where every year's budgets are, and those are available, they'll also see expense reports, many of which are not available
yeah.
because we didn't have it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean we're being shady, it actually means we just saved money.
Yeah,
Fair
if you
enough.
click on May and nothing comes up,
Yeah.
I'm just pulling them up in here. If you click on May and nothing comes up, there's no expenses.
Okay.
And that's, there really haven't been a big change in that because of COVID.
Questions?
Nope, still no questions, and we lost a viewer.
Okay, well, hearing no questions, if there are no other comments from the group, entertain a motion to adjourn. Welcome back, Alice.
Oh, thank you.
Good motion. Councillor Carver seconds, all in favor?
Can I make a comment
Motion's
before we
carried.
close?
Yes, you
I
can.
just wanted everybody to make note of the fact that Deputy Mayor ran a meeting last week, 2 weeks ago, in an hour and 22 minutes.
29.
Sure.
I watched it
Oh, so like cheated, so.
on the weekend.
There was a real cheat.